Welcome to the ISM Rochester Lunch and Learn webinar series. This is the first for 2025. So welcome everybody to today's show. Our program for today will be on Supply Chain 2025 Outlook and Trends. We really want to make this interactive as well. So we really want to hear from you, especially on this particular topic. So Kelly will take questions throughout the presentation. Just put them in the chat or put any comments in there as well. We'd love to hear from you. So our speaker for today will be Kelly Barner, who is the head of content and operations at the Art of Procurement. And I'm so extremely excited to bring Kelly to the show today. Kelly, I'm going to turn it over to you now.
That sounds great. Thank you, Kathy. And thank you for everybody who's taken a little bit of time out of their day to spend with us. So let me first get to know you just a little bit better. I have over 20 years of experience in procurement and supply chain. And I will also say procurement and supply chain because one of my major procurement consulting roles was actually for Conway before they were acquired a few years back. So I've gotten to be on both sides and be on both sides at the same time. In terms of my years as a practitioner, I worked in grocery retail doing location-based hired services, which is always interesting. But I've also done grocery wholesale, pharmaceuticals, and logistics. Maybe not everybody's favorite, but I've also spent some time on the dark side. I was the associate director of consulting services at Emptoris prior to them being acquired by IBM. But since 2009, I've been an independent content creator. First, I was at Buyers Meeting Point, where we then went on to acquire My Purchasing Center. But also on that same timeline, my role at Art of Procurement has been growing. I started as general manager and have worked my way all the way up. Today, I co-own the business with Philip Eidson. So if you listen to the Art of Procurement podcast, you will know my voice as well as his very well. I've co-authored 3 books in the procurement and supply chain space. I was accepted as one of the first 100. It was LinkedIn's Creator Accelerator program, sort of like a boot camp for content, if you can imagine that. And then most recently, I was admitted into their podcast academy. And last year, I was added into the LinkedIn Top Voice program, which has been an incredibly interesting experience and actually links quite a bit to what we're going to talk about today. So I will say, I know Kathy said I'm glad to take questions, which I totally am. Feel free to interrupt me at any point as we go through today's conversation. The only thing I will say in advance is that some of what I'm going to get into today is a little bit technical. So if you'll forgive me, I have notes. I'm going to look down from time to time just because there is no way I will remember a lot of the numbers specifically that I wanted to be able to share with you today. But really, the format we're going to go through is one of my favorites, which is taking news stories. I don't have on this list news junkie, but I definitely qualify. Taking news stories and sharing them in a storytelling kind of format. So you saw the Art of Supply logo on the cover slide. Every Thursday, I have a podcast that comes out. It's either an interview with a supply chain leader or it's a researched solo pod where I'm giving you sort of a deep dive into one of these topics. Most of the topics that we are going to cover today were either episodes from 2013 or 2014, not that I'm rehashing, but that I have stayed on top of because a lot of times I find that these stories hit the newspaper above the fold and then they disappear, but the news actually doesn't stop changing. And ironically, as they get further along and as things continue to develop, that's when the specifics start to become available that we actually need in order to do our jobs. So let me take you through the list of 6 supply chain stories I think we need to be watching in 2025. First and foremost, from a timing standpoint, there's the East and Gulf Coast port strikes. There was a 3-day shutdown back in early November. We've made some progress there. There is the U.S. Steel, Nippon Steel merger, which is up for debate, as we will talk about. Continuing danger in the Red Sea. I think a little bit of up in the air about the EV truck mandates that were rolled out. Some interesting changes happening around de minimis shipping provisions. And of course, the $1 million 3 question mark question, What on earth is going on with tariffs, and how do we factor that into our procurement and supply chain strategies this year? So here's the funny thing, and I was actually joking with Kathy before we hit go today. I woke up first thing this morning to a piece of news that hits one of these stories, and although it's not the first one, the interesting thing about all of these is that they continue to evolve. So just to bring my story completely up to date, in a way, we don't have to worry as much about the East and Gulf Coast port strikes as I thought we were going to. So, just to bring you up to speed on this, this was a major story in the lead up to the US presidential election. We had the International Longshoremen's Association going on strike. That was the 3-day shutdown. They did manage to agree to an extension to January 15th, which we don't have to worry about. They've come to a temporary agreement, and it does still have to be ratified. But there's basically a good faith agreement in place for everyone to abide by what has temporarily been agreed to, just so that the ports keep operating. Now, here's the interesting thing about this. We've seen a lot of union activity over the last couple of years. Usually, it comes down to salary negotiations. Now, salary was settled right out of the gate in this place. The port operators agreed to a 62% wage increase over the 6 years of the coming contract. And the union said, that's nice. What else do you have for us? Because the major issue in these ports is the introduction of automation. Now, when I say automation, sometimes we think of software automation, right? You've got robotic process automation. We can even consider some applications of AI as being automation. This is literal automation. So if you're like me and you have a garage door, and when you get home, you push that button so that the garage door goes up all by itself, even though I pushed the button, the unions are considering that automation. And they've sort of come out and said that they are willing to die on that hill from a change standpoint. They don't want any unassisted automation introduced in the ports. Now, I mentioned the garage door example because in the lead up to these negotiations beginning, one of the unions were at one of these port locations, and they noticed that there was a gate that as a truck approached the gate, some kind of motion sensor, the gate automatically opened. They used that as sort of their red line, their proof that automation was being introduced in violation of the labor agreement that was in place at that time. And so it became a huge issue, especially going into November, but longer term, trying to figure out where is the line between automation for the sake of efficiency and automation that is encroaching upon organized labor jobs. Now, the unions are taking an incredibly hard line. They don't want any automation. And it's interesting because what they have managed to temporarily agree to not only draws a line on types of automation, but it specifically ties the introduction of any new automation to hiring. So instead of just talking about automation, they're talking about being willing to accept semi-autonomous mechanical devices and equipment in the ports. So, for instance, you have something that can operate a little bit by itself. I don't know, maybe my garage door button would count, but that there's always an operator dedicated to that piece of equipment. And so, what has been temporarily agreed to is that yes, these ports can introduce new semi-autonomous cranes, for instance, but every time they put in a new crane with semi-autonomous capabilities, they have to hire a worker. Now, you can appreciate where they are on this. Certainly with the introduction of things like ChatGPT, every single strategic professional in the world has probably heard in the last 2 years, well, that's the end of lawyers. I consider myself a writer. I can't tell you how many times people said to me, well, that's the end of our need for you. Certainly, we have found not so fast. Humans still have a lot of advantages. But in this case, they're really saying, no, we're willing to go on strike. We're willing to break the contract. There is to be no AI, no introduction of semi-autonomous equipment if it replaces jobs. So as of right now, that's what's been agreed to. I think the concern longer term, and this is where we have to remember that, sure, it's been settled, it's going to fall from the headlines. We may or may not hear when it's finally been ratified. But the majority of ports in Europe and Asia are almost fully autonomous at this point. So you have this uncomfortable tension where, on the one hand, we can all appreciate not wanting to be replaced by physical or digitally based automation. On the other hand, this is going to start to put ports in the United States at a disadvantage. Now, we're lucky. Being able to sell things and import things into the United States is one of the most competitive and lucrative markets in the world. So maybe that will be enough to make it possible for the port operators to continue eating those costs, although some of them, we have to admit, will be passed along to shippers and consumers, even as Europe and Asia continue to automate even more. So this is one of the stories I was watching for this year. My hunch was always that it was going to be settled before Inauguration Day, not ratified, but that does seem to have happened. So we should keep this in mind because it introduces cost into the supply chain, but it's at least looking from a continuity perspective, like this is not going to be the concern that we initially thought. Now, the next story that I've been watching, this is one where news broke in the first week of January. And it's interesting because I knew I had covered this in an episode of Art of Supply. I had to go back and check the dates. It was actually September of 2023 that this story really hit the news. Now, the interesting thing is, because Nippon wants to acquire such a massive steel manufacturing capability within the United States, it had to go through an approval process. And apparently, the wheels of federal approval move even slower than the wheels of justice, which are notoriously slow. And it took from September of 2023 until January of 2025 for the Biden administration to come out and strike down this deal based on a federal evaluation that was done. Now, steel is incredibly important, not just because it goes into so much of our infrastructure and determines so many of our costs, but also because this is one of the major categories we'll talk about a little bit later when we get to tariffs with my million question marks. And so having US production capability, how cost effective, how cost efficient that is, compared to how reliant we are from either a production or a cost standpoint on the rest of the world, is absolutely key to most supply chains. Now, this acquisition had been approved at a little over $14 billion. So this is a massive business deal. And the interesting thing is, it's bringing us into the place of geopolitics where Nippon is based in Japan. They are a very good ally of the United States. So it's not as though China, for instance, or Russia, countries that we have diplomatic issues with, are looking to acquire U.S. steel production capability. But there's still this concern that if we let a foreign interest own something like U.S. steel, we're potentially either putting ourselves at a disadvantage or leaving ourselves in a position where we're beholden to a foreign power. So there's certainly concern around that. Now, the interesting thing is, it's not a hostile takeover at all. In fact, U.S. Steel shopped themselves around. They basically got to the point where they said, we can't afford to operate anymore. And so somebody needs to come in and either invest cash or buy us. So they are as upset with the Biden administration for stopping this deal as Nippon is upset that the deal has been stopped. In fact, U.S. Steel has come out and said, if this deal is not allowed to go through and they don't get additional infusions of cash, they may have to stop operations. They may have to shutter plants. And so it's not as though the alternative is, well, U.S. Steel just keeps operating on their own. The alternative is they could potentially decline production or stop operating altogether, which ironically leaves us in even less of a secure position than if we have a friendly foreign government owning U.S. steel. Now, just like the East and Gulf Coast ports, we have a labor angle here. The United Steelworkers have opposed this deal from the outset. They say that they want it to be U.S. owned. Certainly, I think they see the writing on the wall. If a foreign entity owns the company, they're going to have diminished influence over how that company is run. And so it leaves us in this very precarious position where, for right now, the merger or the acquisition has been stopped, but we don't necessarily have a great backup plan for keeping this production capability in place. So, this is a story that we've been monitoring for not quite a year and a half, but almost that long. We're going to have to keep an eye on this, not just as the lawsuits progress, there's always lawsuits, or as we switch from the Biden administration to the Trump administration, or as we continue to hear from organized labor, but simply in terms of U.S. Steel's ability to keep operating. This is a story that through 2025, and I suspect beyond, is one that we're going to have to keep an eye on. Now, I teased when we first started this conversation that I woke up this morning and I thought to myself, now I have to change my notes for the ISM Rochester presentation today. Now, this is a little bit of a multi-step story. So, as you probably know, most commercial shipments through the Red Sea have been paused because of attacks by the Houthis. They originally had started attacking ships that had some sort of association with Israel in the aftermath of October 7th, 2023. Over time, they began to either deliberately or because their information wasn't as good, expand their attacks to ships that are both owned by or sailing under flags from other countries. Now, really large shippers, think Maersk, have actually rerouted so that they're trying not to put anything through that part of the world that they don't have to. It certainly doesn't help that the Panama Canal has had diminished capacity thanks to drought and the fact that they're not really large enough anymore to handle some of the largest container ships that need to travel the globe. But this has been an intensely complicated situation, one that has interfered with shipping from Asia to the US, one that has increased costs, both because the routes have become longer and there are greater security issues. There are even questions about how many of the ships can get insurance coverage, for instance, if they veer from paths that the insurance companies believe are safe. Now, this is where we have to remember geographically what part of the world we're talking about. We're talking about the Middle East, and it's always been a geopolitical hot zone. So you really have a few different interconnected groups. There's the Houthis, who are actually the ones that have been attacking these ships. But then there's Hamas, who directly led that October 7th attack on Israel. And to make matters a little bit more complicated, on December 8th, Bashar al-Assad abandoned Syria, and so he is no longer in charge of that country. So you have all of these shifts in leadership taking place that make it difficult for all of these different countries and groups to continue and coordinate their attacks. Now, what I saw this morning is that we're getting positive signs out of the peace talks between Hamas and Israel. We have heard this before. So it's difficult to know, is this really the time that we're going to get news? Or is this just another hopeful statement that's coming out, potentially rushed in advance of next Monday's inauguration to try to signal that things are going well? Or are we actually seeing a change? Now, here's what I'm watching to see. If Hamas does, in fact, reach some kind of peace arrangement or agreement with Israel, will the Houthis continue their attacks in the Red Sea? I think that's something we're going to have to wait and see because they're not actively involved in these negotiations. It'll be interesting to see if they continue operating on their own. They say, we're going to fight on. It will also be interesting to watch and see, hopefully, as we do get some kind of peace, at what point will the perception of risk start to diminish? Because there's always a window of time where, in actuality, the risk has begun to abate, but people's perception and willingness to try traveling through this part of the world, is just not there yet. They're not certain it's going to work. At this point, it's still largely a military patrolled area. Navy destroyers have been escorting U.S. flagged vessels in the area, but they're trying to discourage commercial vessels from going through this part of the world. Now, part of why I bring up this window of time between the risk abating and the perception of that risk abating is because it is incredibly expensive to ship goods. And there's always going to be this trade off. Who seizes the short term advantage of making the risk calculation that it's now worth traveling through this part of the world again? And does it work out? That is an opportunity that at some point, some shipping company is going to have the opportunity to seize. Will it work out for them? Will it be successful? And how quickly will everybody follow? So, this is another one of those areas you don't necessarily hear about Hamas Israel peace talks and instantly think global shipping, but the two things and the conditions in the region are absolutely linked. Now, bringing things a little bit closer to home, I want to talk a bit about the EV truck mandates. Now, in this case, I'm actually focused on heavy duty trucks. So think specifically if you're in procurement and supply chain, certainly Class 8 tractor trailers. We're thinking about FedEx vehicles. We're thinking about UPS vehicles. The schedule for these mandates being rolled out and the infrastructure that needs to go along with them is something that I think we need to keep a close eye on. Right from the very beginning of this mandate being rolled out by the EPA, backed by the Biden administration, there were always questions about how feasible it was. And there are two reasons for that feasibility question. One is the trucks themselves. The vast majority of Class 8s, for instance, are currently limited in terms of the mileage they can get in the course of the day, as well as the freight they can carry. Now, because of the batteries that these trucks need to have on board, it diminishes how much freight they can put in the trailer because you're still only working with the same engine power. Now, the other question, of course, is the infrastructure. It's one thing to pull into a traditional gas station, hook up your truck to the pump, fill it in some number of minutes, and you're on your way. These trucks experience a great deal of downtime when they're on a charging cycle. Now, this hasn't meant that they haven't played an active part in supply chain and logistics. And there are two areas that I can think of. One is drayage. So this is where you are hopefully safely unloading your ocean freight, and you need to move that shipping container to a nearby location where it can actually be hooked up to a waiting tractor. That very short-term distance, they've been very effective at using EV drayage vehicles, which is essentially think about like small front end towing. It's like a tugboat, right? Except for your shipping container, just to move from the port to where your fleet is waiting to hook up to that shipping container and take it the rest of the way on its journey. The other thing is, I interviewed someone this year that was talking about an alternate model, and the best way I can think to describe it is sort of like the Pony Express. So back when the Pony Express was operating, they were trying to get enormous distances with the US mail in a very short amount of time. And then their concern was not emissions, and it wasn't how much freight can a truck tow. It was how long can this horse run that fast before it needs a break? And so the Pony Express, they would have regular waypoints along the route where they would stop in, trade their horse for another one. And there are EV trucking models that use that type of idea where you're working with one company and you basically pull in, you unhook your shipping container or your tractor from one EV power source, you hook it up to the next, and you're right on your way again. So there have been some interesting models for pulling this into the supply chain. I think because there's so much interest in reducing emissions, and this either through direct logistics or through scope 3 is such an enormous part of the emissions that companies do create. But the infrastructure and the equipment just simply aren't there yet. And there's concerns about whether both of those things can get there, given the investment that's going to have to be made to do so on the timeline that the Biden guided EPA was trying to outline. Now, I tried to pull, this was interesting. 24 was a year of what if, right? We had to wait until November to find out who would be getting inaugurated this coming Monday. Now that we know, we're able to sort of either directly take quotes or extrapolate. Anytime in 2024, I had to get near a sensitive issue that was potentially political, I tried to rely on primary sources, right? Nobody needs any more biased coverage than is already out there from every political perspective you can hope to find. So I try really hard to go back to facts. I could not find any direct quotes from Donald Trump or a member of his administration saying how they planned to handle this. But there are a few related things where we can pull in some evidence to maybe give us a sense of where this could be going. So, for example, we know that Donald Trump is against EV mandates around passenger cars. Gives us a little bit of a sense. It's consumer versus commercial, but directionally, that might be an indicator. The other thing that's interesting is that in his energy platform, he didn't just talk about the availability of different types of energy sources and power generation. He was heavily focused on the cost of any particular source of energy. So whether you're talking about solar, wind, hydro, traditional fossil fuels, there's always this trade-off of how effective is that energy source for the economy and how much does it cost us to generate, store it, move it, put it in a place so that somebody can use it operationally. That could definitely be a concern around EVs simply because of the investment that's going to be required to make this transition. And the last but not least, if you haven't heard the quote by now, you're probably going to hear it an awful lot starting next week. The energy policy is predominantly drill, baby, drill. That doesn't sound like a resounding endorsement of EV. I know the idea is for the U.S. to be a net exporter of energy, and that there's a lot of focus around gas and fossil fuels. And so the next thing we will need to watch for on this, much like the Red Sea, I think we need to start watching for what the truck manufacturers do. Because we get information that's news headlines, maybe a story breaks. Traditionally, California has led the way here, but God love them, they've got their hands full right now, especially in the area around Long Beach. And so this is probably not their focus. But right now, it's all of the truck manufacturers that really have to make a strategy and come up with a timeline for this transition. So the currently in place EPA regulation takes effect with model year 2027. Now, just like with passenger cars, where you're typically buying a new vehicle in a model year, in the calendar year before that model year, the same thing is true of heavy duty trucks. And so as we find ourselves now at the beginning of 2025, we know that the rule takes effect with the 2027 model year. We should be expecting by the end of this year, very early next, to start to get an indication of, are the truck manufacturers starting to convert their operations? Or are they perhaps watching, for instance, what Ford is doing with EV passenger vehicles and the Ford F-150 Lightning, and they're starting to scale that back because the demand isn't there? Will they wait to see if there's going to be an extension, if there's going to be a change in direction, or if there's going to be a different way for measuring compliance with this rule? So the way that they're currently measuring compliance is overall emissions reduction by model year. So for instance, absolute craziest example, if you need to reduce the emissions associated with your 2027 model year, you could make less vehicles. You could bring in horses, right? I mean, there are crazy examples, but that is the metric that's being used. And so through some combination of continuing to make traditional fossil fuel or diesel powered vehicles, having pure EVs, and maybe even getting into something in the more hybrid space, What do all of the major manufacturers like a Freightliner do when they're making decisions around this? They are the ones that are going to have to foot the bill, that have to try to align their production with what consumers, commercial consumers, ultimately want. And so as we watch what they're producing, that's going to be one of the earliest indications we get, assuming something doesn't break next week. It could certainly happen. But this is another one where I think watching what happens with this mandate, with the manufacturers, what's available from a fleet standpoint, will be a story that continues to pop up and break above the fold as we go through the year. Now, de minimis is another really interesting one. And this is a story that I personally enjoy because I think as consumers, we can all sort of relate to this. Shein and Temu are companies that really built their business by focusing on a perfectly legal piece of legislation, but one that was meant to be an exception. So, if you've ever traveled internationally and then come back to the United States, especially on a plane, they pass out that form and they say, like, okay, how much stuff are you bringing back with you and about what is it worth? De minimis is actually related to that. So there's an $800 cap for what you can bring back. And I say back because that's the intent. What you can bring back into the United States without paying duties on those goods. Now, that same rule extends to anything that is shipped from overseas directly to a consumer. So that means it can't go through a wholesaler. It doesn't count if you buy it on Amazon, with one exception I'll talk about in a minute. But what Shein and Temu basically figured out is that if they could use that $800 limit and ship directly from China to the consumer, they could squeak right through that exemption and not have themselves or consumers pay any duties on those goods. Now, the interesting thing about de minimis, it's a Latin phrase that roughly translates to trifles that shouldn't be bothered with. And so the idea is supposed to be whether it's you as a traveler or whether it's somebody shipping things into the US, if it's worth less than $800, do we really want customs having to search? Do we really want customs having to go through the package, deal with the paperwork, go through all of the administrative hassle? Well, ironically, Shein and Temu, and now Amazon Haul, they're setting up sort of a parallel business. They have become so successful that not only is it no longer a trifle from a supply chain standpoint, but absolutely customs should be concerned about what's coming into the country in these packages. Some of it is just simply inexpensive clothing that's coming through in large batches. But there have been concerns about drugs, there have been concerns about weapons, and because these packages are coming in under the de minimis provision, there is concern that, truthfully, they're not being put through metal scanners. They're not being searched. They're not being tracked. And so there's been discussion for a while about how should this be changed. Now, it's interesting, and if you happen to decide to subscribe to Art of Supply, you're actually going to get a little update on this Thursday. One of the early themes that we're starting to hear from the Trump administration is the concept of reciprocity. And this is an interesting idea, this concept that on the global stage, whether it's geopolitically or whether it's international trade, should we treat countries guided by how they treat us? So, for instance, our de minimis shipping allowance is $800 in the United States, and that applies regardless of the origin country of the package. Now, if we look at the comparable rates that other countries have, China's de minimis threshold is $8. So it's 1% of what we allow, they allow in return. If we were to apply the concept of reciprocity to this, that would see, at least for China, that de minimis threshold being reduced from $800 to $8. And I think even at Shein and Temu prices, there's not a whole lot you're going to get in a package, so that wouldn't be worth shipping it. Now, both countries have come out and I'm sorry, both companies have come out and said that no, if this should change or go away, it is not going to prevent them from continuing to operate. Certainly, there would have to be some changes, but we're stuck in a little bit of a middle place on this where the Biden administration has expressed a desire to reform de minimis, but frankly, the clock is ticking and they're running out of time. And the likelihood of anything actually being changed between now and Monday is very small. And so we're going to have to wait a little bit longer and see at what point does the Trump administration pick this up and either make changes or potentially roll it into something else and use it as part of a larger negotiation. Speaking of rolling things together into larger negotiations, the magical word of supply chain this year is the word tariffs. There's been a lot of talk around where does the Trump administration think that they need to go with the tariffs. I think the thing I would say, and this is something I'm constantly reminding myself of, the vast majority of the news and the media that we consume is meant for general consumption. So it's meant for us keeping ourselves up to date as private citizens, as consumers, as people who want to be engaged in the world. It is not necessarily meant to directly influence the strategic decisions and recommendations we make at work. And here's why I bring this up here. You're always going to have hyperbole around something as disruptive as potentially, getting rid of USMCA or drastically shaking up the tariffs that we have with Canada, Mexico, let alone Europe or China, all of which have been floated. I think what I would say about this is in any of the statements around tariffs that come out of the Trump administration, I would offer two things. One is to ask yourself, when is it a threat and when is it a promise, right? Because in some cases, this discussion is not policy. It's meant as sort of the first lob in a negotiation, and a counter is expected. Now, the other thing that I would say about this is that more and more things seem like they're going to be bundled. And we've had some previews of this, especially around Canada and Mexico. So Trump is talking about putting new tariffs in place. But part of what he's rolling into that is not just protecting domestic production or looking at agreements we have in place, but also concerns around drug enforcement and immigration. And so what we're not seeing are the traditional hardline divisions of years past where you'd say, okay, this is just diplomacy. This is just commerce or trade. This is just immigration. This is just drug enforcement. We're actually seeing more and more of these things being rolled together. And so I think for us as business decision makers, we have to be pursuing multiple potential strategies in parallel and even monitoring things that we wouldn't have watched in the past. So if you're, for instance, in automotive and you're routinely importing things from Canada into the United States, you wouldn't necessarily take the time to be on top of major drug busts, right? But if these things are officially tied together, we're going to have to start monitoring different kinds of indicators in order to get the total picture on something that is seemingly as straightforward sounding as tariffs, whether it's good news or bad news. Now, some companies are already trying to get ahead of this. They're saying, better safe than sorry. We're going to start stockpiling. We're going to bring things in and advance. Other companies are saying, nope, we're going to hold off. We're going to wait. We're going to keep our powder dry and kind of see what happens. Decisions like that, sort of like we discussed around the Red Sea, who starts opening those routes back up first? Everyone else is going to be watching. But in the long term, one set of decisions is going to end up being the optimal one. We are probably not going to know until it's too late to seize as an advantage, but really starting to watch who the major players are in each space, including around tariffs, I think is going to be a key source of information around what we should either evaluate, watch, or recommend our own company do. Now, I know we're starting to get close, and I don't know if we will have any questions, but we've covered a lot of really heavy stuff today, right? From ships being blown up and attacked in the Red Sea, to concern about tariffs and all of the disruption that's going to bring with it, to concerns around can we make the transition to EV freight. I think what I will say to you, I'm a huge history buff. I do always try to remind myself as each piece of news breaks, notice it, don't panic, right? If we can't stay calm, in many cases, procurement and supply chain are one of the primary sources of external intelligence being injected into the company and how it makes decisions. And so we may not love a breaking news story. We may not be sure about the direction that a news story is going to take, but we owe it to ourselves and our team and our company to stay calm no matter what happens and focus on getting the facts. I actually, crazy as this sounds, did a series back in October where I looked at the major presidential candidates and compared their positions on things relevant to procurement and supply chain so that we would have some sense of what might be coming down the pike as we got past election day. Now, anybody that I floated this idea to largely said to me, "Are you nuts?" And of course, the first answer to that is yes. But if you create a framework for yourself, and that's why I bring this up, I had to create a set of rules for myself. And I think this is going to be something that serves us well through 2025 and beyond. Don't just take a headline from a newspaper, even if it's a reputable newspaper. Take it as an indication to learn more. So don't read a headline and panic. Get as close back to primary sources as you can. If you can get all the way back to the source, if you can get to a federal government source, if you can get to a quote from the person making the decision, go as close to the primary source as you can get, because otherwise you may be getting part of the story. You may be getting a hyped up version of the story. You could even be getting potentially an unintentional misunderstanding of what something means. So my advice is always keep calm, carry on, continue doing the work. Our companies are counting on us. And of course, I would love it if you would join me as I continue to try to do the exact same thing. This is the podcast. It's Art of Supply. You will find it on every major podcast platform. If you scan that QR code, it will actually take you to a page on LinkedIn to subscribe to my newsletter. That comes out in conjunction with the podcast every week. It will show up in your LinkedIn newsfeed. It will also show up in your inbox. And the player for the podcast will be embedded in that. So if you would like to listen instead of read, and I promise it's not a verbatim copy, you sort of get the option to know, what is this week's story about? What can I learn from it? If you're interested in geopolitics, you definitely want to hear this Thursdays. I've got Samir Kapadia. He is the number one trade lobbyist between the US and India, and his mastery of the current geopolitical trade situation is just super impressive. So I invite you to connect with me on LinkedIn, subscribe to the newsletter, subscribe to the podcast. And of course, if you have any questions or thoughts or feedback, I'm glad to take that in the time that we have remaining today as well.
Well, thank you so much, Kelly. That was very impressive, and thank you for detailing all those different areas from actually last year or 2023 to where we are now.
I know,
I
never
really
a dull moment.
no, I mean it seems like even like January 1st, everything like just
I
started
know.
again. So, but one question that I do have, I told you I was going to ask you this.
Sure.
What do you see for supply chain in 5 years?
You know, and it's so funny because I remember as we were approaching, and I'm dating myself here, as we were approaching 2000, as we were approaching 2010, pretend like, okay, we want major predictions. And of course, the first thought that always comes to my mind is flying cars. Like that's, you know, that's the number one most futuristic thing. I think what I would say And I actually just got a piece of feedback on this about last week's episode of Art of Supply, as a matter of fact, that the changes that we see, even between 2025 and 2030, are bound to be more incremental than some of the blazing news headlines that we read would suggest. So, for instance, oh my gosh, AI, everyone's going to lose their job, everything is going to change how it works. But as you dig into the details of it, okay, probably not so much. And I think we could apply that to certainly any of the news stories that I covered today. You look at the timeline of something like the EV vehicles being rolled out, or you look at the timeline of something like allowing a foreign owned company to acquire US steel. You even look at something like de minimis that doesn't carry necessarily the threat of decision making about what global ocean route does your freight travel. Last week I had covered warehouse automation, and somebody had reached out and said, yeah, but warehouse automation isn't new. Right, but it's always in the details. And so, what we heard last week, for instance, is sure, robotics in warehouses, been there, done that, got the t shirt. We've seen it. Everybody's seen those cute little Amazon robots, right, that scoot around with all the packages on their backs. But the incremental improvement is that now the data flows that can be captured, centralized, analyzed, and factored into the decision making process are bringing warehouse operations closer to operational and financial decision making than they've ever been in the past. So I would say if we look forward to 2025, I'm sorry, 2030, Kathy, it's not going to be a flying car. It's not going to be the robots that are coming to take all of our jobs. It's going to be more embedded. So maybe we'll be doing a more sophisticated job at combining what's happening with commodity prices with how procurement negotiates for something that's 3, 4, 5, 6 tiers removed from a production standpoint away from that commodity. I think I always look back to data more than I do physical changes. The major area where I suspect we could actually see some difference in the supply chain by 2030, I think the enthusiasm for the transition from fossil fuel to EV is so great that in some cases it has pushed us ahead of where the physical technology is prepared to step in and fill a role. So I would actually like to think that whether it's through the replacement of some of the materials going into these EV batteries, where the materials themselves are horrible for the environment and we're largely dependent on China for them. Perhaps we have synthetic materials. To me, that would be an example of something incremental that allows something like EV, heavy duty trucking, EV freight to finally catch on, be cost effective, and therefore achieve scale. And so I would actually suggest that around the evolution of technologies we see today, instead of new inventions, innovations, I think those are going to be the greatest shifts that we see between now and 2030. And I think it's going to be continuing to educate ourselves about every iteration in all of these areas as we go, staying plugged in on the geopolitics. Gee, does it matter that Bashir I'm sorry, Shahir al-Assad is no longer in power in Syria? How does that affect my global freight? Yes, it absolutely does. And so are making the decision to stay plugged in on all of these related stories, as well as to the things that affect us directly, whether it be shareholder interest, consumer interest regulations. I think being informed about all of these surrounding areas gives us that context to understand the incremental improvements that get made. So not predicting flying cars by 2030, partially because I don't want my teenagers driving them. But I do think there will be amazing improvements around data, around analytics, and perhaps some of the underlying technologies that we're seeing interest and investment in the EV space.
Thank you so much. Wow. I have to say this was actually a very enlightening program, and I really thank you for putting
I
this
am
all
glad.
together
It's my
for us.
pleasure to be here.
Okay, thank you so much. I don't see any questions, but I want to let everybody know that please follow Kelly. Follow her on LinkedIn, connect with her, And also listen to the podcast because the podcast is great. And the newsletter, all the information that comes out on a weekly basis is fantastic.
Oh, Kathy, I wish I had a bell to ring. Like ding ding. Yes, please do connect with me, say hi, tell me you were here. Please do subscribe to the newsletter. Please do listen to the podcast. Um, and you know what? The last thought I will leave you with, challenge me. If I said something today out of date, I absolutely want to know. If you disagree with what I say in one of my shows or newsletters, please reach out and let me know because it's the only way we're all going to learn in advance together.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you everybody for joining us. And again, thank you, Kelly.
Thank you so much
Appreciate
for
it.
inviting me, Kathy.
Oh, definitely, definitely. Oh, and one thing we should announce. What about the Art of Procurement's event in May?
Yes, we do. Art of Procurement is hosting our very first in person event. It's titled Catalyst LA. It's taking place on May 6th at the new house. It's actually the original CBS broadcasting facility in Los Angeles. So you can imagine, Phil and I have been very closely watching exactly where the fires are, certainly praying for everyone that is out there and hoping things stay safe. But we will be there in person running a really unique in person procurement event on May 6th. So if you're interested in more details about that, feel free to reach out and let me know.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. I just wanted to make sure I put that
Thank you,
out there for
Kathy.
everybody. Yep. Okay, so at this point, we're going to end the show. Thank you so much for joining us today. Have a great week.